from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to welcome you to a special series over the next few weeks that's entitled Facing the Threat. In order to bring you this series, we'd like to thank the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment for providing those guests due to their conference that was held in October at Gonzaga University. On our first program and first week of this series, we wish to discuss particularly the developments in Canada and Germany as it relates to far-right movements. In order to accomplish this goal, we are very pleased to welcome to our program three guests. I first of all welcome Cecilia Cowley, who is the director of the West Coast Coalition for Human Dignity. She is from Vancouver, BC. Cecilia, welcome to our program. We're delighted that you have come here to be with us to discuss this very serious topic.
Thank you.
I'm also pleased to welcome to our program Jonathan Mazeski, who is the executive director of the Coalition for Human Dignity, and that organization is well known for its research on issues of hate groups and extremist movements. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
And our third guest is Randy Lee Taylor, who is a member of the West Coast Coalition for Human Dignity, and she is a writer on far-right movements and is, as I indicated, a board member of that organization. Randy Lee, welcome to our program. We're also happy to have you with us.
Thanks, Tony.
May I start, Cecilia, with you and take advantage of your knowledge and expertise. Would you give our viewers who are on this program, both in the United States and Canada, some information on what is the situation in Canada today concerning far-right movements? And as you deal with my involved question, does it vary from one part of the country to the other one? Is the West in any way different from the eastern part of your country? And again, the seriousness of the activities that might be going on.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the West Coast Coalition for Human Dignity has its mandate primarily in the West Coast, in the province of British Columbia. And as far as the developments in the far right, I think you can safely say that it does vary across the province, or across the provinces, and with varying degrees of danger and threat involved. I think one of the more significant developments in the far right in Canada has to do with the role that what we would call scientific racists or Holocaust deniers play within the far right movement, and that's nationally. The role played by Holocaust denier Ernst Sundel, for example, who is central in the international far right, and his role in producing Holocaust denial material through his own publishing company. I think that in terms of feeding the far right in Canada, that's one of the more significant components.
They're often described as revisionist, and so in his doctoral materials he is denying that it even took place during the Hitler's reign. How much impact or effect has this movement had, and this particular one that you've identified, with people in Canada?
Well, I think it really varies. Like, for example, in BC, while there are groups who are actively involved in street forms of violence and vandalism, they're not happening to the same degree as what you're seeing in the United States, and I think that what's happening is the building of more of an intellectual kind of foundation for a far right movement, for a broad social movement.
Randy, can you pick up on that and identify other groups that are in Canada in addition, excuse me, to this particular one Is there a lot of variety? Is there disagreement in their philosophy? And do some groups emphasize certain philosophies that are very similar to those groups in the United States?
Mm-hmm. To answer part of that, I think in central Canada, Toronto region, in the 90s has produced a number of significant figures in the youth movement, among them being George Birdie, the founder of Resistance Records, and his goals, names, and activities in that is to produce a youth-based movement, neo-Nazi skinhead-based movement, and as well attract other youth into that through racist rock band Rahawa, and then the Resistance magazine, which also produces compact CDs. We see that in Western Canada, some differences. You have more of an influence from Christian identity. So even within skinheads across Canada, you see Christian identity playing a factor, where the young folks in Canada, racist skinheads, are attracted to the Aryan Nation's philosophy, similar to, and in fact borrowed from the model that you find in Idaho at Hayden Lake, the Aryan Nation's compound. And there's always been a significant contingent of Canadian racist skinheads from British Columbia and Alberta that travel down each year to the April youth congresses that they have. So where we don't see that same kind of influence of Christian identity in the East Coast or Central Canada. So there are regional differences in that as well. Cecilia mentioned the role that Canada has played in exporting Holocaust denial information via Ernst Zundel.
So there is across the border, back and forth communication and travel with these groups in the United States and Canada. Is there any evidence that also your groups in Canada have connections and work with groups in Europe?
Oh, definitely, and particularly with the racist skinhead movement, which is very much international in character, with the advent of the worldwide websites and the access to a sort of an international music industry and promotion. There doesn't seem to borders are somewhat meaningless in the philosophy of that movement. It is truly international in character and seeks its leadership across borders in Canada, the United States, in Europe, Germany, England. And in that has some sort of global unity.
Jonathan, let's move now to Germany and talk about what are the characteristics of the movement there.
Well, much as Germany is now the economic powerhouse of Western Europe, so too is the neo-Nazi movement of that country, the most powerful in Europe. The movement, of course, has a long history, which you can trace back to the actual Nazi regime of World War II. There are a number of old SS veterans organizations which provide actually a direct link from the past in terms of personnel and leadership to the younger generation of today. I made a 3-week tour to 15 different cities in Germany in February of this year. I was hosted by what I think is clearly the most important anti-fascist organization in Western Europe, and that's centered around a magazine called Searchlight. They helped coordinate my tour. And I think a number of things are clear about the neo-Nazi movement in Germany. One, it has this same international character that Randy Lee was alluding to, in that these activists see themselves, these neo-Nazi activists, as carrying out a role on the world stage. They want to see Europe as a white Europe, and the issues that they are organizing around are also many issues, the same issues that we see the far right using in the United States: welfare, immigration, especially in Germany, and especially in the case of immigration, the neo-Nazi movement there, I think, has had an effect on the mainstream of political life there. Just 2 years ago, in fact, the German parliament rejected, or actually overturned, the right of asylum, which had been codified and enshrined in the German Constitution. And part of the reason that the mainstream political parties did that was the overwhelming street violence that had occurred throughout the country in Rostock and Mölln and Hoyerswerda and other cities that many of your viewers may remember from the early 1990s. And one of the effects of that massive street violence, the burning of these immigrant hostels, was the overturning of the asylum law.
That's really a very significant point you're making about, even though those groups may be small in number in Germany, but because of the activities that it has actually affected government policy.
Exactly. You can be, much like the neo-Nazi movement is today, a small fringe, and yet still have an impact on the mainstream of political life. And when and how that happens, I think, is a very important question that all of us need to ask.
Cecilia and Randy Lee both, is the government of Canada been able to resist some of this movement in a different way than Germany, or has it impacted policy there?
Well, I think that how the Canadian government has responded to figures within the hate movement has really been emphasizing, you know, their human rights legislation, and which are quasi-judicial bodies, which have very limited, you know, mandate in terms of prosecuting or penalizing violations of human rights activity. In terms of, I think what's more disturbing is how some of the more dangerous ideas are not being challenged at all. I think that what the emphasis in Canada and Canadian institutions has been to try and you know, identify and penalize very specific extreme forms of behavior and activity, but they don't recognize the danger of ideas that do not get critiqued or challenged and enter into the mainstream political debate.
So I hear you saying that both at the national level,
Mm-hmm.
in organizations and also in local communities, that other than dealing with punishing
Mm-hmm.
illegal behavior, that they're trying to not have a counter-educational movement or to ignore it and it might go away, they think?
Right. Hasn't been an effective response to contextualizing the ideas that they provide. One example is that just this past summer in August, a libertarian conference was held in Whistler, BC. And that conference was organized by an American organization, and that conference included one of Canada's most notorious Holocaust revisionists, Doug Collins from BC, but also included people who were from the extreme fringes of American political society, which includes Senator Charles Duke from Colorado and Larry Dodge, a founding member of the Fully Informed Jury Association. Now, Senator Duke and Larry Dodge both have expressed sentiments which are very sympathetic to militias, to American militias, and they have very what we would call, extreme notions of sovereignty. And what was interesting about that was that conference was actually opened by a Canadian member of Parliament from the Reform Party, which has a significant number of seats in the Canadian legislature. So what we're seeing there is not only a lack of critique of these ideas, but actually important government, public officials, and organizations seeming to entertain and welcome these notions
and
into the
by doing
news.
that, are you suggesting that also adds credibility in the eyes of lots of people
Absolutely.
to the movement?
Absolutely.
Jonathan, would you do a comparison for us, both in Germany and the United States, dealing with what we've just been talking about? How has Germany and the United States dealt with the difference between individuals' right to free speech and action that might be illegal, and also is there a counter movement in educating citizens to those doctrines?
Well, I think there's very uneven development, depending upon the state of the far right, what kind of threat and how strong a threat that they present, either in the United States or in Germany, you will see different responses on the part of government and human rights groups. In general, Germany does not have the same tradition of free speech that we'll find in the United States. Clearly, they have a different history, which may provide good reasons why they don't. Some of the symbols and ideas that animated the Nazi regime are by law prohibited in German society. Whether or not those laws are actually implemented, prosecuted, if those offenses are prosecuted, is another question. My sense was that in general they're applied in very specific situations. For instance, one of the most important neo-Nazi propagandist in Germany is actually an American, a man from Nebraska by the name of Gerhard Lauck. And Mr. Lauck was responsible for a long time for the direct exportation from the United States and into Germany of mass distribution propaganda, neo-Nazi propaganda. And the German government, when Lauck eventually did set foot in Germany about a year ago, the German government did arrest him, try him, and prosecute him for the distribution of that material. I don't think you'll see that same kind of response in the United States. The German government has at times been very aggressive towards prosecuting the terrorist groups that the far-right movement in that country promotes. However, at other times, when it appears to suit the political agenda of some segment of government in Germany, such as the anti-immigration sentiment, that crackdown, if you will, did not come. So it's very uneven, and I think you'll find similar sorts of issues in the United States.
So there's mixed
very
results.
Mixed. And I also think that if we want strong critique from government of the ideas that these groups promote, if we want a heavy hand from government to stop neo-Nazi terrorists and whatnot, then it's at least in part the responsibility of human rights organizations and citizens to demand that and to provide the public will so that government and public opinion leaders can carry that out.
Randy Lee, let's come back to you, and I introduced you with that you're a member of the West Coast Coalition for Human Dignity, both the work that you are doing and Cecilia, and Jonathan just referred to that. What is the role of the human rights organizations to both educate the community and to deal with public policy? And I particularly, since I emphasized that on the program, would like you to address that in relation to Canada.
In Canada, there's been two very distinct levels, and I think the community has played a large role in the formation of our multicultural policy, both at the federal level and provincial level. And that policy has empowered a variety of organizations to deal with issues under the multicultural umbrella. How effective they've been at doing that also within the human rights community, I think, has been less so. And I think that there are regional difference, geographic differences. Canada is a huge nation, and even within the province of British Columbia, you have rural communities and urban-based organizations, and it poses its own challenges and difficulties to sort of develop a united and a fundamental base of understanding about these issues. I think that's the process is beginning, particularly in British Columbia. But I still think we have a long way to go, even to meet what's happening here in the Northwest on the American side of the border, community understanding and awareness, and the ability to go from small local community issues to larger regional issues to statewide issues, and that I think that there's a long way to go. But I agree with Jonathan that I think that the need is for communities, individuals, organizations, to be able to press for policies and responses, as well as coming up with our own community awareness about these organizations and individuals on the far right and the effects that they do have.
Cecilia, in my opening question, which was very involved, we didn't get to one part. as you've talked about what was happening in Canada, both you and Randy Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm getting a sense that there seems to be more activity in Western Canada than Eastern Canada, at least for as a government official, welcoming a conference and all, or is that in error? How are particularly political leaders of Eastern Canada dealing with this issue?
Well, it's hard for actually me to comment on, specifics in Eastern Canada. We're quite limited in terms of our resources in terms of monitoring what's going on in BC alone. Although I understand that, institutions, I think, do across the country have a real difficulty grasping, what to do when there are these incidents of violence. I think that there's a tremendous willingness among Canadian public officials and the Canadian population to believe that these kinds of activities and organizing of the far right are anomalies in Canadian society. And they're not willing to, create a whole public policy infrastructure to deal with something that they consider to be an anomaly. And in most circumstances, something that is an American phenomenon being imported into Canada for, brief periods of time. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think even, for example, in, I believe it's New Brunswick, where there was a recent arrests of neo-Nazis who had been responsible for violence in a community there. I think that the response of the municipal government has been, not able to deal with the whole issue. They've organized community meetings to try and get some consultation, but they don't, I don't think that there's enough information guiding their response to who needs to be at the table to talk about public policy, who needs to be involved in creating a community response.
I'll start with Jonathan and then has Randy Lee to also respond to this. If you were doing for our viewers kind of a profile of individuals or age groups, whatever, that they being the extremist groups, are most effective with today, how would you describe who is most susceptible to the doctrine?
Well, I think that there are, within the far-right movement, these neo-Nazi groups and so on, you will find different organizations that appeal to, and in some cases are tailored to, different people from a variety of occupational groups and from a variety of social classes and whatnot. For instance, the Holocaust deniers, these pseudo-scientific racists, tend to be better educated. Their income levels tend to be higher, and their occupations tend to be more stable and whatnot. Their role within the movement is that of the intellectuals, the folks who are going to pioneer the ideas for the movement. There are other far-right organizations, for instance, the racist skinheads, because they tend to be more involved in violence, and they tend to serve as the sort of shock troops for the movement. They attract younger people who have perhaps more free time and have more reckless sense of adventure and whatnot, if you will. Now, all of these groups, and this is an interesting facet of the far right, you will find in Europe, in Canada, in the United States. And I want to point that out because I think it's important to recognize that a neo-Nazi skinhead, in the town of Spokane, is likely to see him or herself as, again, an actor on the world stage. They're not properly termed a gang. They don't exist, and they don't see themselves as fighting over turf or over narrow neighborhood issues or for control of some kind of market. They are interested in political terrorism, typically. And that's an interesting facet of the movement. It's also an angle, this international, this global they're sort of thinking locally thinking globally and acting locally, the old refrain. And a big part of the white supremacist movement is trying to put that into practice for very nefarious ends. And you will find that in all of these countries.
Randy Lee?
I agree with Jonathan, and I'd also add a particular area of concern is college campuses. In the marketplace of ideas, we're seeing a reassertion of certain forms of ideas that lay the groundwork, I believe, for far-right activity and white supremacy, and particularly eugenics and sociobiology, notion of a hierarchy of races, which is starting to reemerge on campus. It had been rejected for a number of decades, and has now found a place on college campuses as well as other issues. And I think that we need to provide an alternative to those views and revisit the critiques that were used to suppress the validity of those notions, because I think that they're pseudoscientific. So I think that that's an area of concern, college campuses.
We're almost out of time, and I want to get from you, before the program ends, recommendations. What would you advise the people of the United States, Canada, and Germany to do? That we've alluded to this, but I want to get more specific. What should you, or what would you recommend that be done that is not being done? Jonathan, would you like to?
I think that the most important lesson that I learned from my tour through Germany is that of the importance of grassroots organizations in the struggle against these far-right groups and the far-right ideas. Germany has its own unique problems with the far-right, with the neo-Nazi movement, but what they also have is a very well put together anti-fascist, anti-racist network of people throughout the country. The 15 cities I visited there all had very active, what they call Antifa groups. And they're very important in building that movement infrastructure.
And that's what you're doing here too, with different local groups. And then when you go into a coalition, you're going from the local base to a more regional base.
Exactly.
Would you like to add, Cecilia? We're just about out of time.
I think that I would reinforce the notion that any community response that human rights groups take on has to be an informed one, that it needs to come out of actual research and accurate information about the level of activity that's going on by far-right groups and what their political beliefs are. You know, I think that that's really critical.
On this note, I have to bring our permanent conclusion. I think all three of you have been most informative, and good luck at your conference. And ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to be with us again next week when we'll do part 2 of this series entitled Facing the Threat. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.